Okay, so good morning and welcome board, SLT and other colleagues to our board meeting. It's a beautiful sunny day here in Cambuslang. I hope that you all have appropriately nice weather wherever you have to be zooming in from. We've got a packed meeting today. We've got a public session and we've also got a private session followed by strategy day. So we've got a fair sized chunk of work to get through, but we will have regular breaks hopefully so that we can pace ourselves and get through the whole day. We've got some apologies for absence from the Chief, and I believe Liz is going to be joining us a little late, but apart from that I believe that we have a full house. I have mentioned that we've got a private meeting after this. Can I just check, are there any items on the current agenda that we believe should be taken in private? No. And having had the opportunity to look at the private agenda, are we all content that those items on the private agenda should remain on the private agenda? Fab. That's great, thank you. Declarations of interest. Has anybody identified any interest that they need to make me aware of? No. If any emerge during the course of the meeting, please just highlight that and we will deal with them as we proceed. Before we get into the main body of the meeting, can I just remind us all that if we're going to be asking questions, it would be really helpful if we introduce ourselves and our formal role before speaking. I don't always remember. Obviously, I am Kirsty Darmont, I'm the chair of the board, so having formally introduced myself, I can invite you also when the time comes to introduce yourselves also for the sake of those perhaps watching the recording. With that said, can we move into the minutes of our previous meeting, which was on the 31st of March, which was chaired in my absence by Fiona Thorburn? Are there any issues in the minute of accuracy that we need to attend to? Anything that needs to be captured differently? Are we content, therefore, that this is an accurate recording of that meeting? Yeah. And thank you very much, as always, to the minute takers. Excellent minutes, as always, capturing a meeting which I believe was expertly chaired by Fiona, so thank you to Fiona for that. That takes us into the action log, and Ali.
Thank you, Chair. If I just refer members to page 16 of the pack and page 1 of 2, you'll see in the rolling action log summary we have one action in total, and that relates to item 18.3 from the 31st of March 2022 meeting, and it's in regard to the combined risk and performance Q3 progress report and just that progress report in general. Just to confirm that the board are content with the position statement update and that detail will be included in the next iteration for the June 22 meeting.
Content? Lovely, thank you very much. And do you want to just continue on, Ali?
Thank you, Chair. So just moving on to item 7, the decision log. Two aspects to this board, one being the impact of the decisions and the assessment for board decisions that have been made, reflecting back from the meeting of the 29th of April 2021. You'll now see detail under each of the decisions that were made at that time, just to confirm that the board are content with the detail as provided. And the second point being the meeting on the 31st of March 2022, just to confirm that the board are content with how the minutes, how the decision log was captured. Thank you.
Content on that account? Lovely, thank you. That completes that aspect. So our next item is the Chair's report. You have, as part of your papers, a copy of my diary. I'm not intending to go through any of this in any detail. It's there for you to see. I would like to flag, however, our trainee firefighter graduation ceremonies that we had. This was the first one where the trainees were able to actually be in the auditorium sitting alongside me. I think we may have had some other hybrid versions on the way, but it was lovely to have the trainees actually in the room and their families watching by VC. Really fantastic events, and they really are the highlights for me when I see the degree of pride that the firefighters have in meeting that achievement, and I have to say in the instructors' pleasure in getting them to that stage. So fantastic events, and really great to be welcoming more trainee firefighters into the service. I'll hesitate briefly in case any of you have any questions on any other aspect of my diary.
Kirsty, Nick Barr.
Yes, please come in, Nick.
Hi, Nick Barr, board member. Kirsty, it's not really a question on that. I just want to sort of reiterate what you've just said there about the trainees, and I think it was one aspect of the board's role that I think all that did have the opportunity to go and see those graduations really appreciated that, and I just wouldn't mind getting an idea of when that might resume for board members, because they really are very they're a good thing to attend.
They are, absolutely. I will bring Ross in, but the one thing I might say first is that at the moment they are very much attended on a skeleton basis. So there are only a few members of SLT spread out right across the auditorium. I am very keen that board members get to attend. However, I think that the absolute priority for me is that families are able to physically attend. And I would want families to be able to attend and be there as part of the ceremonies at the same time as or in advance of board members. But what we might be able to do, if we can't have you physically attending, is allow you to join via VC, so that you can at least be part of that process. Ross, you might be able to give us a bit more practical information.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and morning, colleagues. Ross Haggart, Deputy Chief Officer. Yeah, it was one of those things that unfortunately fell by the wayside, Nick, during the COVID restrictions. And as the Chair's mentioned, we had 2 graduation ceremonies this month because we've been running 2 courses concurrently here at headquarters. The trainees themselves were able to come into the auditorium because we were able to accommodate them with our existing control measures in place. And as the Chair's mentioned, we then enabled families and friends to join remotely to witness it. As we move through the summer months, we're hoping to continue to ease our COVID control measures and our COVID restrictions, but we'll very much keep those under review, because although clearly the legislation is changing in terms of control measures, we need to make sure that we maintain our organisational resilience and minimise transmissions as much as possible. So it's certainly something that we would like to see back to some semblance of normality, but that'll need to be balanced against the risks associated with any transmissions in organisational resilience. And as the Chair's mentioned, I think it would be really positive if board members were included in that ability to join remotely, and I'll certainly take that up with colleagues that manage those events.
Thank you.
Lovely, thanks for that point, Nick. Any other comments or questions on my diary? No, thank you. Ross, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. Very similarly, colleagues, there's an extract from my diary, quite a short extract because the last meeting was only a month ago, so it just really covers the month of April. Again, in the interest of time for a very busy agenda, I'll not particularly highlight anything, but happy to take any questions on any of the appointments that are contained within the report. Thanks.
Sorry, Chair, me again.
Please.
Could I just ask a very quick question for a quick update on something I've not heard of for a while, and that's the Reform Collaboration Group. Just a really brief statement of where we're up to, and for refreshing my memory, which organisation currently holds the chair of that group, please?
Yep. So Police Scotland currently hold the chair of that group, but the chair moves to Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. I'm going to suggest it's in May, so it's actually very soon. There is a meeting next week of Reform Collaboration Group, and in my absence, Fiona is going to be attending that meeting. It might be worth a very quick update on Reform Collaboration. Ross, are you the best person for that?
In terms of the RCG work itself, it's probably better for Mark to give that update. What I can do though is advise there's also a Blue Light Collaboration Board that sits under the Reform Collaboration Group that's been created to look, as the name would suggest, at collaboration opportunities. I think there's 9 different work streams that we're looking at to investigate collaboration opportunities between ourselves, Police Scotland, Scottish Ambulance Service, It's currently chaired by David Page, who's Deputy Chief Officer with Police Scotland. And we met last week just to get an update report across the different work streams, but that formally reports into the RCG, but it's starting to make some good progress in a number of areas. But in terms of the RCG proper, Mark's probably a better place to give an update.
Yeah, please, thank you, Mark.
Yeah, happy to do that. There's actually not an awful lot to report at the moment, Nick, because as Kirsty said, the next meeting of the RCG is the 6th of May. We've yet to see the agenda for it from Police Scotland because they manage it. But at that meeting, as Kirsty says, we will formally take over the management of the RCG for the next 2 years. What we've also agreed is that going forward, there's going to be a joint secretariat of the RCG, because we are getting very late production of papers from some of the RCG colleagues. So what we've agreed is that we'll have our resource and we'll have some resource from Police Scotland to manage it on an ongoing basis, so we can actually make sure that it functions a bit better in terms of the production of agendas and forward looks at what's coming up, because I'll be honest, I don't actually know what's going to be on the agenda next week, and it's less than a week from the meeting. So it's not a case of not seeing the papers. I've not even seen an agenda, neither will have Kirsty or Fiona. So we're picking that up at the meeting next week, in addition to the stuff that Ross has talked about in terms of the Blue Light Group, which is looking across a whole range of areas about potential scope for further collaboration across the three services. But even there, we're finding it difficult at times. The group that I lead, looking at kind of corporate and strategic services, very, very difficult to find time in people's diaries even to have some discussion. So there's some real issues we've got about reinvigorating the working of the group, I think. And again, I suspect that that'll be one of the items on the agenda next week, but I don't know for certain because I've not seen it. I keep coming back to that. But if it's useful at the next board meeting, I can certainly give a full update on the RCG and begin to talk about the forward look for the RCG once we take over the chair next week. And that's one of the things that I've put down at the officers group as a marker. I want to see a programme of work for the next year for the RCG agreed, so we know what's coming up, where and when, what will be coming to the chiefs and the chairs group, what will sit at the officers group, and having that secretariat properly manage that on behalf of the group is going to be a key part of that.
Thanks, Mark, and I'll defer to the chair as to what she'd like to do about that. But I would welcome either a discussion, but it doesn't necessarily have to be at a board meeting. But I think some form of discussion or you know, a single briefing note about that, and just about what the strategic intent is for the next couple of years as we take the helm. That would be excellent. But thank you very much.
Absolutely, Nick, and I think there will be a step change in the amount of information that we're getting at board level when we do take the chair. It's perhaps worth saying that although the RCG group is not perhaps meeting and as accelerated as we might like, the work that's been taken forward, my understanding is that there's lots of very interesting and useful reform work going on. It's the administration, management and governance of that isn't always as visible. It's probably worth letting you know that the Chair's Manifesto work, which is about those strategic intentions, is ongoing, and a draft document is currently with the SPA and Police Scotland, so that they can have some conversations internally about what some of their priorities are in anticipation of us taking the chair. So there is work going on in the background. It's about the coordination of that we really need to get tightened up on. I saw, Angelina, your hand pop up.
Thank you, Chair. Could I just add in a little request for the briefing paper? Mindful of the fact that, all going well, SFRS will have its new 3-year strategic plan finalised by the end of this summer. I would find it enormously helpful if the RCG briefing paper could include a very clear bit that flags the connecting points between our 3-year strategic plan and its relevant elements and the forward plan that you speak of, Mark, for the RCG, because logic would suggest there will be some real points of interface there. So if that could be drawn out in the paper, that would be super. Thank you.
Absolutely, I think that would be really very helpful indeed, and be familiar with some of the content within the Chair's Manifesto. Absolutely, that ties in with our strategic plan, so making those connections will be straightforward and very useful. Mark, would you like back in again? Oh, you're still on mute, Mark.
Apologies. The strategy group that I've been leading under that blue lights element of it, we're looking at the various strategic documents of the organisation. So we've agreed to table our strategic plan after draft plan after approval by the board to that group. Ambulance are working up at the moment their strategic plan, so that's due, I think, in June. So again, they'll table that. So we'll be doing that mapping exercise, as you've said, Angelina, back into the overarching ambitions of the RCG to see where they fit and where they'll support the work of the RCG and vice versa. So we'll pick that up over the course of the next couple of months in that group. And again, I'll bring that back to the board as part of the briefing so we can map out for you where the connections take place. You will also see in the next couple of weeks, probably next board meeting, there's a paper coming its way to you on our partnership working. Richard and the team have been pulling that together at the moment, went to the last Good Governance Board meeting and is coming up to SLT shortly. And that will set out for you all of the partnership working that we're involved in across the service. And just to give you a sense of the breadth and depth of what we're involved in. And again, Richard's team have got that as part of the work plan for the year ahead. How do we bring all that together in a way that we can properly report through the board and account to the public on? So you'll see much more of this over the next couple of months anyway, Angelina, but I'll specifically pick that point up about the strategic connections across the various strategic plans.
Super, thank you. And my apologies, I omitted to identify myself. I'm Angelina Foster, board member.
Thank you. If we're content, no further questions for Ross, we will move on to committee reports now. We haven't actually had any formal meetings of committees, and we saw their minutes at the last board meeting. So by exception only, I'm going to invite any of the chairs if they have anything to add, any major developments between the last committee and this committee. If there are no others, then I'll move on. I am aware that the People Committee did have a workshop. Barry, do you want to say a little bit just about that? Because I'm aware that that was quite an important meeting for the committee.
Yeah, thank you, Larry Wiley, board member. Thank you, Kirsty. I couldn't find the mouse to indicate that I was going to come in. So yeah, we had our first of two workshops, just looking at that wider assurance reporting, because we're conscious that we've had a number of conversations over what will probably be the last 6 months within the committee, and we wanted to make sure that we were coming to the executive with some sort of consistent opinion. So we've started work on that, and we've got another quick touch base on Friday morning, that's tomorrow morning, before we sort of start to have a more collaborative conversation around what that might look like with everybody involved in the workshop on Friday at Monday afternoon. So I think it's progressing quite well, and it's nice to see that the committee's coming round to, I think, a reasonably consistent perspective on things, which will hopefully make that conversation a little bit more straightforward on Monday as well. So I don't think there's anything else really to say, Kirsty, at this stage.
Lovely, thank you. And I had the pleasure of attending that meeting, which was in person with board members, which was great in itself, and I think that really helped generate the kind of original thinking and collaboration that we needed to be able to help that committee really move forward. So well done to you as chair there, Barry, and the board members who attended. Felt very productive indeed. Have we any other updates, ad hoc updates from the committees? No. Lovely, thank you very much for that. That allows us to move into the annual governance review, a really important piece of work that we do to make sure that our governance is as strong as possible. And Mark is going to orient us to that item. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Kirsty. And it's Mark McAteer, Director of Strategic Planning, Performance and Communications. Can I firstly apologise to the board members for the lateness of the papers, all 120 pages, so I know you've all gone through them, looking at every comma along the way. We were working on this right up to the beginning of the week, and for obvious reasons I'll come on and talk about. So really apologies for the lateness in getting them to you. The review work, as you know, we undertake this every year. We look at right across the board all of arrangements around about governance. We look at our schemes of delegation, committee terms of references and so forth. So this report pulls all that together with proposed amendments to all of that. The key parts of the appendices that are worth highlighting, and I'll pick up the detail in a second, are some proposed changes to the scheme of delegation, a new code of conduct, which we've been waiting on for a wee while as a service, some tweaks to the committee structures, and some proposals around the corporate template and how we'll be reporting to the board in future. And again, some slight adjustments, very minor adjustments to the terms of references of the committee. Those are the kind of key areas. If you look at Appendix A of the document, that sets out the key changes across all those pieces of work. As I say, 120 pages, but we thought it would be useful to summarise all of those changes or the proposed changes in Appendix A. So if I could perhaps just turn to some of those changes. One of the areas we've looked at is the standing orders, part of our annual review, and there are no proposed changes to the standing orders for the committees or the board meetings. We think they're sufficient, and as part of our discussions with board members, as we've went through the review, again, board members have been content with the arrangements around about how we hold our meetings. In terms of the scheme of delegation, which the details sits in Appendix C of the pack of papers, we are proposing a couple of key changes to the scheme of delegation. We're first of all trying to clarify the roles and responsibilities of the chair and the chief officer, and you'll see that at sections 2.1, 2.2 and 2.3. In the past, we've simply put through a hyperlink to the governance and accountability framework. What we've done this time is now summarise each of those sections within the scheme of delegation itself. We've still got the hyperlink through to the full document, but we'll summarise just to make it clear what the responsibilities of the board, the chair and the chief officer are within the scheme of delegation itself. The key change that we're proposing sits in section 4, which relates to delegated authority. And this is the piece that we've been working on up until the beginning of this week. It's involved myself, Richard, the governance team and also the legal team to advise Kirsty on this. What we're proposing at 4.3 in the scheme of delegation and then at 4.4 is a degree of flexibility, because when we have unplanned circumstances where you've got the absence of the chief or a director, we haven't had within the scheme of delegation sufficient flexibility to allow us to cope with that. Different if it's been a planned absence, where the chief officer, for example, when Martin last year went in for his operation on his shoulder, we could plan for that and make sure that we were covered throughout that period. It's when exceptional circumstances arise, the scheme didn't allow us to respond flexibly to that situation. So what we're proposing is that we put in 2 clauses, one that relates to the chief officer's roles. So if exceptional circumstances arise where the chief officer is absent and there is no designated acting chief officer, the chair in the name of the board can discharge through the scheme of delegations those responsibilities to another member of SLT, predominantly going to be the deputy chief officer. And it would only apply for the duration of that unplanned absence. If it was a planned absence, the normal arrangements would apply through the scheme of delegation. And similarly, we wanted to make clear at 4.4 that should a director be off on an unplanned basis or an ACO, again, we've got sufficient flexibility within the scheme of delegation to accommodate that, either where we have a formal acting up individual covering for a director or assumed responsibilities for heads of function on behalf of that director. So again, we just wanted to make it clear and transparent within the scheme of delegation that in those exceptional circumstances we can cope. So it allows us to deal with things like, should a contract require to be signed during a period of unplanned absence, we've got sufficient scope within the scheme of delegation to allow us to go ahead and do that and to properly discharge the function. So that's the biggest change in terms of the scheme of delegation. And again, maybe pause for some discussion on that, Kirsty, if board members want to come in.
No, I don't see. Oh, Brian, yes, please.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and forgive me if I kind of stray into another aspect of scheme of delegation, but I certainly welcome those amendments in terms of just bringing it to the one document. Oh, beg your pardon, Brian Baverstock, board member, bringing those kind of references into the one document. So thanks very much for that. Just on your point about 4.3, I wonder whether absenteeism is the correct word to use. Perhaps it would be just better to refer to it as unplanned absence. So that would be my comment on that. I'd have some sort of general comments, if I may, just on the scheme of delegation, and I appreciate some of these points have not been altered, but reading afresh the document as you do, it gives you an opportunity to just think about the words on the page. And if I could refer to the text in terms of urgent actions, and I mean, we did experience this in terms of COVID, so it's not that I'm suggesting the actual practice of urgent actions is in any way kind of flawed. But looking at the actual text, it says that the chief officer may take reasonable and appropriate action in relation to any function not delegated to the chief officer role. Now that feels very broad brush, and I wonder whether it needs to be contextualized, particularly in terms of what I assume it to mean in particular around about operational matters.
Yeah.
So maybe just leave that for you to consider. That I have no difficulty with the scheme of delegation as such, but there are elements of delegation that are more potentially contentious for the organisation, particularly around about settlement agreement, the employment of consultants, and the award of contracts. And I wonder, there is a kind of bit of a catch-all in terms of the engagement of consultants in excess of the limit of £100,000, which refers to needing to get approval from the board to then go to Scottish Government. But my point is really whether, because of the potential contentious nature of some of these things, almost regardless of the limit, whether we need to have some sort of statement in the scheme to reflect that, and also to reflect that the criterion needs to take account in some way of the actual risks associated with the decision making, you know, because even smaller amounts potentially could be reputationally quite risky for the organisation. And on the contracts bit in particular, the situation we find ourselves in with the CCF project makes me kind of wonder, you know, where the delegated limit, you know, how much can one individual actually sign off for a major strategically important contract across the organisation. So these, I hope, are some sort of specific examples where perhaps some tweak to the wording might be helpful and just provide a wee bit of a safety net, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks, Brian.
Yep, and specifically on that, I suspect, Brian, on your first point, and I will welcome any comments, including from Richard, and or I can see John put his hand up too, if we think that this is not appropriate. But to me, something like the word operational and around urgent actions probably would resolve that. Knowing that if it was going to be of strategic importance, it would need to come back to the board to further delegate. We also, if we remember, did during the early COVID period put in an additional document which effectively put some extra guidance around how that could be done during COVID times. And we might even want, Mark, to revisit that just to see if making reference to that might be useful, because that did allow us, through consultation with the chair and the relevant committee chair, allow us to make very rapid, more significant decisions if those were required. Although, as it happened during COVID, we did not actually need to use that. So flag that to Mark. Settlement contract consultants, I think there is something about it being contentious. And again, thinking about the words, because we've got similar words around policy development in the organisation, so there may well be some words relating to that would help strengthen that and flag that anything contentious probably needs to come back to the board. I know it's always problematic knowing what contentious means, but it indicates that it's not acceptable just to delegate and not move on. And I'm going to bring John in because I think he might be able to be helpful around contracts. John.
Yes, good morning. John Thompson, Acting Director of Finance and Procurement. Just to pick up on that point, Brian, around contracts, obviously the other part that's on the agenda today is the amendment of the standing orders for the regulation of contracts, and that also has elements within that around consultancy and how we deal with consultancy. We certainly follow Scottish Government guidance, and there is specific delegations both to myself at lower levels around consultants, and also that we have to perform a business case to get some detail around why we want a consultant to be brought in. So it was just to highlight that there is further, if you like, controls and guidance within the scheme, within the standing orders for the regulation of contracts.
I just to clarify, John, is that only in cases where the estimated expenditure exceeds £100,000?
No, so there is further delegation for lower levels, even to the point where it's above £2,000. There has to be a business case produced. There has to be information gathered as to why we think we need to bring in a consultant. That type of information, Brian.
Thank you.
Hello, colleagues. Can you hear me all right? Put a thumb up, please, if you can. Lovely. Thank you very much. I've jumped onto Ali's computer while we try to get the bigger issue in the Braidwood resolved. So I heard what was said about contracts. John, thank you for that. But I didn't hear any more than that. I wonder, John, and this, we may have moved on from that, but I wonder, John, whether, and Mark, whether we might make, if we haven't already, make specific reference in the scheme of delegation to that additional guidance around contracts, and that might tie that in rather nicely. If that sounds like a sensible option. I can see that Tim's hand's up. Does that make sense to everybody to go to Tim next? I haven't missed out anything important. Lovely, thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Chair. Tim Wright, board member. Apologies, Mark. I don't happen to, for a variety of reasons, have Appendix A available to me at this moment in time. So apologies for my inability to be properly prepared for this, and you'll probably say it's the answer that I'm going to the question I'm going to ask is in the paper. But just to clarify in my own mind, how will we register, track, and be able to audit any of these delegation decisions? If so, in the circumstances where we do delegate authority, how will we be able to track it and audit it in the future? That's my question. Thank you.
So if in those exceptional circumstances that we spoke about that we have to take action, the chair will then delegate the authority to the persons acting up in terms of the chief's role, and she will retrospectively then come to the board to seek approval. Clearly, if the circumstances arise around about a board meeting, we could deal with it then, but it's to give the chair that ability in between board meetings to act on your behalf, and she will then notify the board of that, and we can have a full discussion at the subsequent board meeting to explain the circumstances, etc., etc. So that's how we would accommodate that, Tim, if that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you very much. I just wanted to understand that procedural point. And in principle, I'm absolutely very much for more flexibility and the ability to operate effectively.
Lovely, thank you. Before I bring Brian back in again, can I suggest in relation to Brian, please come back in again, Brian.
Thanks, Kirsty. It was just on Tim's point, actually. What I've seen work quite successfully elsewhere is that there's a standard form, a template that just routinely records delegated actions, and that might be a nil return or it might list some actions, but then there's just some sort of formality structure round about it. So that's an option perhaps to consider.
Yep, lovely, thank you. And I will leave that with Mark to think about how best we might use a template that's similar to that. Yep. Mark, would you like to continue with the other main items on that you're raising with the Board for Change?
Thank you. So again, sticking with the scheme of delegation at section 6, again, specific powers delegated to the Chief Officer. Under acquisitions and disposals, we're proposing to include 2 new points for clarification relating to heritable and movable property to allow the Chief Officer to make decisions around them. This has arisen because the National Fire Museum is closing down. They have some of our assets that were donated to them by legacy services, and under the terms of agreement, they have to ask us as a service, what should they now do with those assets, either sell them or return them to the service. So again, it's just to cover an eventuality around about those types of issues on behalf of the Chief Officer, that the Chief Officer can then make those decisions under the scheme of delegation. In terms of section 621, we've amended it to, rather than just say legal, to describe it as legal proceedings and litigation. Apologies for those who might have spotted the typo in Appendix A. The reference to what says 4.3 should actually be section 4.5. It just allows us to make a clarification between prohibited documentation, etc., for legal action and more general legal proceedings. So it's a simple tidy up round about the heading. So we would now refer under 621 to legal proceedings and litigation, and then again within the scheme we've detailed out what we mean by that. So it's just a point for clarification. Those, Kirsty, are the key changes that we've proposed within the scheme of delegation. I'll pick up the points that have been raised by board members, and we can certainly revive it. The urgent actions, we will clarify it's for operational reasons, Brian. We'll make that clear. In terms of the issue around consultants and contracts, we'll get that linkage into the procurement guidance built in, and also build in a clause around reputational risk as being a potential key trigger for bringing things back to the board, not just the monetary value. And again, we'll look at that standard documentation or template rather for recording delegated actions, so we can then account to the board for any use of the delegated powers thereafter. So we'll pick that one up as well. So subject to that, if I could perhaps move on then, Kirsty, to the other documents, there are some changes.
Yes, please.
One is the members' code of conduct. Board members will be aware that the Ethical Standard and Public Life Scotland Act prescribes all devolved bodies, including Scottish Government, should operate towards a code of conduct. The Scottish Government produced the code of conduct late before Parliament for approval, and then that binds all subsequent public authorities into that code. Standards Commission then produce a model code that all public bodies are then asked to take into their own organisation. Because the legislation and the model code are approved by Parliament, we cannot vary without permission from that model code, so we have to just adopt it. If we wish to seek any changes to it, we have to seek approval for that, because that's how the Standards Commission then hold us and other public bodies to account, is through that model code. The last time the code was updated was in 2013, and in 2020, the Scottish Government had recognition that things had moved on in society. Issues around, for example, the use of social media. They wanted to update the code further, and it took through to December of last year for that final model code to be updated and approved by Parliament. So it was laid before Parliament by Scottish ministers and approved in December last year. So we've been waiting for 14, 15 months for that launch of the consultation through to the production of the model itself. And that was something that the auditors have picked up, and as Brian and others through ARAC will be aware of. But we were waiting on the new model code. That's now in place. So we've adopted the model code, and we've made some changes to our code of conduct that you can see set out in the documentation. Again, I'll take you through some of the key changes before opening up for discussion. Like the model code itself, we are now saying throughout the code of conduct, it's about I, because this applies to individual members of the board. So to make it clear to them and to the public, that emphasis throughout the code has now been given in terms of the language. And that's really to clarify the individual responsibilities of members to adhere to the code. In terms of the general conduct within the code itself, we've given greater emphasis into how we should operate, how you as board members should operate your relationships with everyone as you fulfil your duties as a board member, or in situations where people understand that you're a board member of SFRS. So it gives us kind of greater clarity around, again, where the codes and the standards apply to yourselves as board members. Again, we've also highlighted, as the model code does, so further detail around bullying, harassment, the use of social media, and gifts and hospitality. So they're set out within the general code itself. Within registration of interests, 2 additional categories have been added to the model code and to our own. One refers to election expenses. Clearly that does not apply in the SFRS context, but we've just put it in because if we didn't, we would have to go back and seek approval to remove it from the code of conduct. So it's in there, but it's really a redundant clause within the Code of Conduct for ourselves because no members are elected to the board. And the second one relates to close family members. Again, just to clarify to the public, where potentially a conflict could arise for a board member where a member of their family is undertaking business with the service or doing some transactions with the service. So again, there's some clauses just to clarify that. That is then reflected through in section 5 in terms of the declarations of interests. So they've been revised, they've been streamlined, they make it clearer what the responsibilities of board members are in terms of declaring any interests. And again, it gives a bit more insight into the circumstances through which you should interpret some of that. What we're proposing is that, subject to approval today, we'll have a subsequent discussion in detail at a board strategy day round about the code, and we'll bring to that discussion some examples to give a bit more sense of how does this apply in practice. What I found in the past is that when you're working with a code of conduct, you can read it, but it's not until you have that collective discussion, we show some examples, discuss those examples, it gets all of us on the same page in understanding and interpretation in practice what this might mean. So we'll organise that for a future strategy day. And then the last part of the code of conduct itself is the annex about breaches of the code. And again, we'll just set out some further detail around the role of the Standards Commission, what their responsibilities are and what happens should a suspected breach of the code occur and what role the Commission would then play thereafter. So with that, Kirsty, again, I'll pause to take any comments on the code of conduct from board members.
Any comments, colleagues? I certainly thought that this code, so I'm fully signed up to the code of conduct, and in reading it, I didn't think it would pose any difficulties to us as a board, given the very high standards of behaviour that we see around this table. And I presume from no other hands going up that we're content with that being implemented. Lovely, thank you. Mark, please continue.
Thank you. In terms of committee structures, there's only 2 minor changes. In terms of the committees that Paul Stollard and Malcolm Payton will sit on going forward, and again we've detailed that in Appendix E. In terms of the corporate templates, so the papers that we produce on behalf of the board, again we've done a minor tidy up of the papers themselves. This was discussed at SLT and Good Governance Board. So we've amended the classifications so that it's clearer for people writing reports what they should be applying for in terms of decision-making authority, scrutiny, etc. from the board or a committee. And again, we've put in some additional items around about the strategic implications to cover new business items, mental health being one of the important areas over the last couple of years for the service. So we're now asking people when they produce a paper to consider, are there any mental health implications from the paper that should be notified. In terms of how we then deal with those strategic implications, we're proposing some changes to the documentation. Rather than have the big list at the back end of the reports themselves, we're proposing to give it as a checklist to paper writers so that they consider these issues as they write the paper. And if there is an implication, be that in performance, finance, mental health, the guidance is that issue should be built into the paper itself rather than just a few lines attached in the current format that we've got at the back end of the paper. So we'll work with people as they produce the papers. We'll work with the heads of service who ultimately edit the papers before they come forward to make sure that that new approach to how we cover those strategic implications works for us as a service. Because some of the issues were being highlighted down at those strategic implications section and not properly reflected and discussed for board members in the body of the report itself. So we want those issues in the body of the report. So that's why we've proposed this change. I've seen it work in other organisations on that basis, and it's worked quite well. But over the next few months, we'll work with the heads of functions and others to help them in terms of how they draft papers so that those papers properly highlight strategic issues for board members, and therefore those issues become the issues that are discussed at the board and committee meetings themselves. We've also clarified in terms of the guidance for people writing papers, what do we mean by scrutiny, whether that's at SLT or at board. Here's the kinds of issues and questions you should be thinking about as you draft those papers. And again, it's just to make sure that people are aware of how to write a paper in order to convey the information that you as board members will need in order to conduct your role as scrutineers appropriately. So it's to give them that sense of the types of questions and lines to think about while they're drafting the papers. again, we had some discussions with board members on that, and we've reflected some of your thoughts about how we produce papers going forward, and that will now sit in the guidance. So again, things like the length of paper, to try and stop people writing very long papers, but rather than focus on the proper strategic issues, set out properly, set out in a way that those issues are clear to board members, so that you can then pick up and discuss and debate and do proper scrutiny on that. So again, the new guidance hopefully will help on that. We've agreed to have at committee level hot debriefs. So at the end of a committee meeting, any issues that have come up, we can debrief on that there and then. And again, that will give us good insight where we perhaps may have to adjust some of this going forward. So with these changes, we want to, in a sense, road test it with board members over the next few meetings. And again, if we need to adjust further, we will. So with that, happy again to take any comments on the proposed templates that we're using going forward.
We think this is a continuous improvement process that we're going on with the orientation of papers. I can see board colleagues would like to comment. I'm not sure who came in first, but I will bring in Malcolm first, please.
Thanks, Chair. Malcolm Payton, board member. Yeah, I think it's great to see all this, and I absolutely take the point, Mark, about you know, not having papers that are too long. One of the ways we can do that is making sure that some of the detail is in the main report, not in appendices. And I just wonder if there's maybe a way of, you know, in the main report details is maximum 1.5 pages should include. I wonder if we should add something in there that just emphasises that a bit more, that there should be sufficient information here to understand what's going on. It shouldn't just be in an appendix. I've not worded that very formally, but just to you know, to clarify that actually, it certainly in my view, I would rather have a slightly longer main report if it allows us to get a grasp of the key issues. And of course, there may well be appendices that are there for reference.
I 100% agree with you, Malcolm. What we'd agreed when we discussed this at SLT was that the governance team will be there initially to help support people. So it's not about the length of the paper. The paper, your word is the key word, has to have sufficient information to allow scrutiny to take place. So we'll work with people over the course of the next few weeks and months to make sure that we build up that understanding. Yes, it's appropriate to continue to use appendices, but the body of the paper itself should contain sufficient information to enable good scrutiny. That's the key point we're trying to get through from this.
Really helpful, thank you.
Thank you for that, Malcolm, and for the helpful response there, Mark. It's absolutely the direction we would like to go. Lesley.
Thanks, Kirsty. Thanks, Mark. Lesley Bloomer, board member. Couple of points. Firstly, on the table of executive scrutiny versus board scrutiny, this is a really interesting table, and it really did make me stop and think about the difference between the two. I'm not sure that I agree with the split in some things, and I say that knowing that I am occasionally it is occasionally suggested that I stray into the more executive area. So perhaps to help colleagues preparing reports, might it be possible to consider a strategy day session on that table? So to help us just think through actually what lies in executive scrutiny and what sensibly lies in board scrutiny. The things particularly that prompted me to think about that were, you know, we would have an interest in cost, we would have an interest in safety, we would particularly have an interest in options considered, which I actually don't see in either of the categories. So I wonder perhaps prior to issuing that to guidance to report writers, whether we might just bash that around a little bit more. I've got a couple of other points, Kirsty. Do you want me just to go into those?
Let me hesitate on that one just briefly. So I'm just thinking, so this is clearly we're wanting to formalise these papers today if we can, and I think it would be an error to hold off formalising this paper and these papers more widely for that to happen, knowing how busy we are in the next few months. However, I would be very happy for us to have a slot on a strategy day or a development day to do that as a continuous improvement process, so that we were looking at that to make sure that they were better for either the next iteration or for the simple approval process, for example, in the autumn of another version of this, because I mean these are important that we have these updated, but there's nothing to stop us updating them again in 6 months.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I can see Mark. Other board colleagues, do you have an objection to that position? Okay, so we'll highlight that these are things that we would want to continue to work on, and the board support team will make sure that we have at least an hour slot for that conversation as a matter of priority. Lesley, please come back in again.
Sorry, I was just wondering if Angelina was trying to get in there, Kirsty.
Thank
On
you.
that point, Angelina, please come in.
Very well spotted, Lesley. Yes, my thoughts were in relation to that table with a couple of specific suggestions for tweaks, if that's all right, Kirsty.
Yep.
So, you know, in context, my understanding is this is not about describing everything that we would always wish to cover as board members. It's absolutely guidance to authors of reports to help them anticipate territory where we may choose to go. And therefore, 3 quick suggestions. In the first bit of the table under who, the suggested board scrutiny line is, do we need to seek reassurance on blah, 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 blah. I confess to having a slight phobia for the word reassurance in the context of governance. It's just too flabby for me. I have a strong preference for the language of assurance.
Agreed.
In cases like this. So that's number one. Secondly, under what, where it says what is being proposed, are there any concerns that the risks outweigh any potential benefits, blah, blah, blah. I think, and Brian, I'm straying into the territory that is yours and that of your committee, but I think a very sort of what should become a banker question for the authors to anticipate is, are the risks inherent in this proposal consistent with the board's risk appetite? So that authors offer us a perspective on match with our risk appetite or not. And clearly we could, choose to accept that or not, but I think it should be part of what is anticipated. And thirdly, and finally, the last chunk of this, the how, the board scrutiny is described as what additional support can we provide to the Chief Officer, SLT exec. I do think if this is our formal record, that line has to include support and/or constructive challenge, because it just feels really lopsided to me only to have one of those two things in at that point. That's me done.
All of those make absolute sense to me.
Yeah.
And with board agreement, we should do that. Lesley, if you've got very specific points similar to those that you want us to think about right now, I'm also content to consider them. Please come back in.
I was going to offer an alternative. I think given the number of question marks I've got over the questions in the board scrutiny, Angela has been more constructive perhaps than I in offering specific tweaks, but this is the first time we have seen this. I wonder whether an alternative option would be to drop it from this iteration of the annual governance review and the governance documents, and instead work on it in the background and bring it in at the next governance review. Because I'm wary about in our official governance documents, board scrutiny not actually saying anything further about our questioning the how, because I think we need to be assured on how changes will be rolled out and so on. And I think that goes beyond what additional support can be there. Though I accept Angelina's point about constructive challenge does bolster that point a little.
Can I maybe come in on that, Kirsty? Again, I think Angelina's point was important to highlight. This is a guide for the authors, Lesley, so this is not the full description of the roles of the board and exec members around about scrutiny. So this is just to help them. These are some prompts. I think Angelina's suggestions are very helpful, and we can certainly build them in no problem before we issue this out. So I think they're really helpful. I think that suggested discussion, Lesley, around about those roles and responsibilities between execs and non-execs. We've had those discussions before. I've always found them to be very healthy and useful discussions. And I think that's where we can maybe tease out some of these issues between ourselves more fully. But I think getting this guidance out to people is quite important because it will help them sharpen the papers as they come to you. These are not the issues where we look at the roles and responsibilities around about scrutiny roles. I think we can have that discussion more fully in a session at a strategy and information day. And I'd be really encouraging to do that. So I would still be keen to get this out. As Kirsty also said, this process is continuous improvement, so it doesn't have to be once a year. So over the course of the weeks and months, if there are any other issues where we need to make sure we give some supplementary guidance to people, we can certainly pick that up, bring it back to the board for consideration and approval and get it out. So it doesn't have to be an annual process. It's just that we do this as part of the annual review. If we have to make any adjustments in year, we have more than got the means to do so. So I would be keen to get it out with those suggested agenda amendments from Angelina. See how it goes, reflect on it over the next couple of months. If we need to tweak it further, we can tweak it further on behalf of the board and have that separate conversation around scrutiny and how we say discharge our full responsibilities on that. That would be my suggestion to the board.
Brian, I'll bring you in for review.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsty. Yeah, I absolutely agree with the points Angelina has made, and I understand perfectly the points that Lesley has made. I certainly see this, and you used the term earlier, Kirsty, about continuous improvement. This is about that, and I think continuous improvement means that board members have a role to play in that as well. So I would certainly favour, sucking this and seeing how it goes, and encourage board members to, on an ongoing basis, provide that feedback. Yes, this worked. No, this didn't quite work as well. What about that? And between us, we will get a much better product. And I have to say that I think we're starting from a very good point in all of this. I don't think we are really in a situation of deficit here. I think we're about kind of sharpening things up. But it's important that the executive team understand what we consider sharpening up to look like so that we provide that feedback.
Thank you, Brian. Malcolm, before I hopefully pull this together.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I just look at it. I absolutely take the point that this guidance is not defining what board scrutiny is. It's there to support people writing it. But the paragraph above it, at the foot of the previous page, says the table clarifies the types of scrutiny that will be applied. I just wonder if we soften that language to something like the types of questions likely to arise, or something like that. That takes it away from being a definition of scrutiny, so to speak, and helps at this point, and then gives us a chance to think it through in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Malcolm. That's a good suggestion. We'll pick that up as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. If we remove the word clarifies and make it slightly softer, I think that would resolve it. So I'm going to suggest that imperfect guidance is better than no guidance at this stage, but that this is something that we will work on over the next few months so that the next iteration is stronger yet. But very helpful challenge from board colleagues around that. Thank you. Continuing with you, Mark, I believe, for additional papers.
Yeah, just the last one on this, Kirsty, and again, it's the terms of reference of the committees. Some minor changes set out again in Appendix A, where we've made a tweak to ARAC's terms of reference, to the people change of committee change of terms of reference, and the remunerations, appointments, and nominations terms of reference, but they're very minor tidy up points. The last point I would draw your attention to is the quality impact assessment framework. And again, as part of the governance review, we've had a look at that, we've revised it. We have taken the liberty of inserting a reference to the good governance framework, which is the item on the agenda next. So subject to your approval of the good governance framework, we will include that as a reference that people should be looking at as part of the equalities assessment process as well. So again, with that, Kirsty, happy to take any comments or questions from board members.
Okay, lovely. So if there are no further ones, what I'm proposing we do is we approve this suite of papers subject to the additions and amendments that we've already discussed and clearly minuted around the scheme of delegation and standing orders, and the proposed amendment to the corporate templates, with the addition there that we will continue to improve these over the next few months, both in an individual session, but also as a result of those hot debriefs that we're having at committee, so that these become living documents that we improve over time. Are we all content as a board on that basis? Malcolm, please come in.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely content. It was just a slight sort of point of order. There was the change of committee membership. Was raking through quickly. Is that actually an explicit recommendation? Does it need to be, or have we covered that? It was just to make sure that you know, if I'm changing committees, I think Paul is, then that is actually formally approved. It was just to make sure that was covered. Thanks.
Yeah, my understanding is we're approving all of what is in these papers, including that, subject to the small exceptions that I've highlighted. So absolutely, Malcolm, don't worry, you're going to get an audit and risk. I know it's going to be the highlight of your year. So, so we'll make sure that is...
But, I thought Brian might be worried about me joining audit and risk, but that's another story. That's...
Lovely, thank you very much. Paul, your hand has popped up.
Just to say, I am totally content with this as well, and I'm very grateful for Malcolm for the swap.
Lovely, thank you for that, Paul. That allows us to then move into the good governance framework, and it remains with you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsty. Again, really pleased to present to the board the good governance framework, or the proposed good governance framework. As a service, in terms of the audits that we've experienced over the previous years, we've always been given kind of high praise for our approach to governance within the service. So what we wanted to do was to build on that, to continue the journey of improvement around governance. And therefore, what we're proposing is that we bring all our key governance documents together into a single framework. It makes it much easier for people to understand governance across the organisation, how it operates, where different elements of governance responsibility lie. So it's to make it more clear, more open to people, and simpler for people to understand how governance operates. That's the clear intention of it. We also, as part of this, and it's something I'll come on and talk about, want to make steps towards integrated assurance. We think that's a key part of how we should develop our governance going forward, and we've set proposals out in the framework. Again, I'll pick that up. But the key message is around making things simpler and easier to understand sits at the core of this. Again, like our previous discussion on our governance papers, the intention is that the governance framework would be a living document. So again, it would be subject to ongoing improvements, iterations, and change over time. So we'd want it to evolve as we evolve our approach to governance. But this gives us a kind of, I think, a key focus on, again, the roles and responsibilities around the organisation, particularly for the non-execs and the execs, and what our roles in governance are, subject to those detailed discussions that we just agreed that we will have over the course of the summer. It sets out how we will operate in governance terms and what our standards are. And again, it's quite important to highlight that those standards that we've set out have drawn from the Chartered Institute for Public Finance Accountants, good governance standards. We've adapted them to suit ourselves and our organisation, but they are part of that international governance standard, and we can show how we meet those standards through the proposals set out in the framework itself. What we've also tried to do, I think, throughout this, is set out our proposals for integrated assurance. We've set out in section, I have the work ready in front of me. Too many pieces of paper. We've set out in section 6 our lines of defence as part of assurance, and in section 7 our integrated assurance map. Now, the map that's contained within the document is purely illustrative. What we would propose across the years, working with internal audit colleagues, is to build up our approach to integrated assurance mapping, and that gives a further layer of detail into the assurance process in terms of those 4 lines of defence that were set out in section 6. And we think that will be a key piece of work for the service across the year. It gives us that further governance assurance. Therefore, if we get the papers right at board and committees, the strategic issues, implications for scrutiny, etc., the assurance mapping gives us that below the waterline assurance that how we arrive at those issues, we are assured that the processes and mechanisms for control, for leadership across the organisation are right to fulfil our governance responsibilities and duties. So that's going to be a key piece of work, I think, for the year ahead from us. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions from board members, any comments on the framework itself. Can I just say that when we took this to SLT and to the Good Governance Board, executive officers found it incredibly helpful. One of my colleagues said he wished he'd had this available to him when he took up his current post, because it would have made understanding governance across the organisation so much easier in his current role. So I say comments from colleagues so far have been really positive, but really keen to hear what board members have got to say on the document and any suggested amendments and improvements to it. So again, over to board members, Kirsty.
Lovely, thank you. Nick, I'll bring you in first.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies, Chair, just previously for dropping out, rejoining, and then dropping out and rejoining. So that's just for the record. Mark, I note your comments about other senior colleagues thinking this was very useful. I too found it very useful. I started off by reading it thinking, wow, this is pretty long and wordy, but actually when you sort of really paid attention to it, I was trying to think of what you could drop out of it, and actually it is particularly comprehensive and covers everything I could possibly think of in the handy person's guide to the services governance. So thank you very much for that. Could I just ask a couple of clarifying, or a clarifying point around 8, you might guess, committee assurance statements. It's on page 21 of this document. Just one thing really about this. Do you see this comment around assurance statements as something that's applied to an annual report, or something that's going to be on a board by board committee report basis? By that I mean, when the chairs speak about the committees, do you see us shaping that in the form of a more formalized statement, or are we going to continue giving the sorts of reports that we are giving now, which will then be summarized in some form of more structured committee assurance statement? And my supplementary question to that would be, interested on that very last written narrative, the paragraph on that page. The mechanism for assessing the adequacy of assurance will need to be defined. However, the care needs to be taken, etc., not to be overly prescriptive, which I would welcome. I think that's important. I just wondered if you've got any comments to say about that last paragraph. But back to the first question. Thank you, Mark.
Well, if you take your first question, yes, it would be an annual basis, but we would still continue, I think, to have the updates from committees, yes, committee chairs at the board meetings. And again, maybe once we've got the framework agreed with you, that becomes the basis then for the updates. So we've got a structure to the updates at board meetings. But the intention is it's an annual assurance statement from the chair and from the committee to the board around the activities of the committee over the course of the year. And again, the work that's been done to support the committee in terms of its scrutiny from the execs and from the service itself. So it's an annual process that we propose.
Okay, thank you. Just for your clarity there, Mark, there was a tiny bit of work. It was only a little snapshot of something done within the IGF that tried to give some advice to chairs and new chairs of committees of the sorts of things they should be bringing to the board and how they may report that. That's just for your own information.
Okay, thank you. In terms of that paragraph about the mechanisms for assessing the adequacy of assurance needed to be defined, again, I think as we take forward the approach to integrated assurance, and again, within that context, the assurance statements, that's the kind of conversations we have to have, I think, with yourselves as board members. So I think we wrote that paragraph deliberately not to be prescriptive. We need to have those discussions and get that right between ourselves so that we're all agreed. What do we mean by key terms around about what is substantial, etc., etc. So that's something I think we have to evolve between ourselves over the course of the next period. And Nick, that would be my suggestion, rather than trying to be prescriptive in a framework document. Because again, come back to the point, if it's a living document, that may change over time as our confidence in governance changes over time as well. That's all I would say. So rather than be overly prescriptive, if we can agree it between us, we can revisit that agreement over time as and when necessary, so it remains a live process for us as an organisation.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So on my list, I would normally bring in Steve, then Stuart, but I'm aware that Brian put his hand up with some assertion electronically. Is it very specifically on that point, Brian?
No, it's more general, Kirsty.
Okay,
I
thank
didn't
you.
mean to be assertive. Apologies.
No, it's a skill and a talent, not a criticism. Steve, please come in.
Thank you. Steve Barron, board member. I'll need to take lessons as to how to put my hand up assertively. That's a skill I don't have, but I'll need to learn it. So my view is that there is lots of really good stuff in here, and I'm delighted that it's been found to be helpful by those who have seen it so far. So clearly it's got a purpose. I also agree with Mark that we start in a position where governance is already good, and this framework document can only improve it. Now, I wonder, though, whether or not it achieves its aim of simplification, and I've got a couple of comments aimed at that challenge. I think a framework document, almost by definition, needs to be one to which you refer if you have any doubts or if you're seeking to understand things better. And yet this document, I think, does a bit of being an action plan as well as a framework. So if I could draw your attention to the principles of good governance, the 6 that are set out there, these seem to me to be commitments and actions rather than principles. For me, the principle would be leadership, integrity, transparency, accountability, sustainability, effectiveness, rather than the statement of what you're going to do in order to improve governance. So the definition of principles is a system of belief or behaviour for serves as a foundation for well, no, let me say that better. A fundamental truth or proposition that serves as the foundation for a system of belief or behaviour or for a chain of reasoning. I'm not sure that, as drafted, that these principles meet that definition. So maybe it's the word principles that's wrong, maybe standards would be better, but I also think that it would be wrong to make this document about actions, because the actions are for other parts of our work. Whereas this document, for me, a framework needs to be a reference document that stands as the test for the actions. I hope I've made that clear.
You've made a very interesting point there, Steve. Of course, they aren't our principles, but maybe Mark will say a little bit more on that.
I think, Kirsty, that Mark said that they had been adapted from other principles.
Adapted from the SFRS principles for good governance, Steve, yes.
Indeed. So it's the action commitment part of it that, for me, doesn't sit as a principle.
Yeah. Okay, we might be able to clarify that in the document. Certainly, one of the things when I first saw it, Steve, because I do like the document, I really like it. But one of the things I said to Richard was that the challenge next is to take that principle of simplification further. This is the first time we've pulled everything together into a single framework, and I think it worked really well. But I want to simplify further, and I think, again, that'll be a task. Well, it will be a task for Richard for the year ahead, because we were just discussing objectives yesterday. So we will look at that, and again, we'll maybe pick your point up, but we have simply taken that part of the framework from how SFRS set out their principles, what they expect organisations to do to demonstrate those principles in action, and what type of evidence they would expect to see across organisations that would then justify those statements of how we think we're performing against those principles. We've simply copied from SFRS what they've done. The adaptation is simply in terms of language, things like annual operating plan, for example. So we've not varied from the SFRS standards. We've simply adopted some of the terminology we use within it. But I'll take your point, and maybe again something we'd have a discussion about off table, and we can feed that into our thinking for the year ahead, because I say we want this to remain as a live document. We want to keep adapting in it, our approach to governance so that we remain strong in those terms. So again, something we can pick up, I'd be really pleased to do so.
And it almost feels like we've got a little bit of a session, perhaps, for our away days in the autumn, around 2 or 3 issues around governance and improving governance, just as a a touch base. You're still looking a little perturbed though, Steve, so I'm going to give you the option to come back in.
I think I'd be interested as to what other board members' response to my challenge would be. Because if it's just me, then let's just rest on the fact that it's actually a really good and helpful document. But my challenge is, does it simplify, or does the action plan part of the document create ambiguity?
Fair point. I will bring other board members in. Stuart, you're next, please.
Hey, thanks, Kirsty. Stuart Ballingal, board member. I had two comments. One of them was very similar to Steve's comment. Whilst I found that the document was a very useful repository of all sorts of things, it didn't for me simplify in any way the structure, the governance structure. It was really quite long and quite complex. So I would be supportive of what Steve is saying. Having said that, I think the assurance plan initiative is exactly what we're needing. I do think it's a piece that's missing from the governance the governance framework within the organisation. And my question is really, why do we think it's going to take so long to produce it? And are we going to produce the usual Rolls Royce rather than a starter for 10 for a living document that we can all work with?
Sorry, just in terms of the timing for that, I mean, I'm saying the year ahead. I'm not saying it'll take us a year, Stuart. So just to be clear, as soon as we can get it, we'll get it done. So we're looking at the moment at the work plan. I was discussing it with Richard and for his team yesterday, so I'll get details from that. I'll get you a timeline about when we would expect to commence and conclude that piece of work. But it won't take us as long as a year now. Sorry, apologies, that's just my use of language. I'll get you a specific answer on the timeline when we would expect to bring it to you for the initial discussion, and then we'll refine and adapt it thereafter.
Okay, thank you.
Barry? Oh, sorry, Brian. Brian, and then Barry and Paul also. Brian.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think Steve's challenge is an interesting one, and maybe the term framework is the wrong term. I mean, Stuart refers to it as a repository, and in a sense, that's exactly what it is. I think for me, the simplification bit of it comes in pooling bits of information that were previously held in different locations into a single point of reference. And certainly on my initial reading of the document at an earlier kind of draft stage, I was struck by how much information was in it. But now that I see it in its kind of polished form, I think it's more of a readable document. It may not be kind of perfect in terms of the question that Steve poses, but I think it's a very good kind of starting point, and it can be refined as we go forward. But really what I wanted to say was to really commend the effort of the team in pulling this together. I've seen quite a number of these type of documents in other settings, and it is definitely one of the best documents I've seen. And that, I think, Steve recognised the imperfection or the inconsistency that you allude to, because if I look at 10 other such documents and you looked at them, you would level the same question at those as well. I think as kind of Stuart has highlighted, the emphasis on assurance is really incredibly welcomed. It is an incredibly important direction of travel. And I think for me, that is the guts of this document. And I think Nick's question about, is that committee assurance being provided annually or on an ongoing basis, is an interesting question. And its examples, I think, the risk or tension between over-prescription around assurance, because if you look at what happens in health, for example, there is a really structured reporting format that uses the currency of assurance regularly, routinely, and some people believe that that's overly prescriptive. So I think your response, Mark, is really about kind of just seeing how this goes. I mean, I think it's really helpful to express things in terms of assurance where it's sensible to do it, and certainly annually it's sensible to do it. And it would be good as a matter of routine in receiving reports from boards that the word assurance and the reference to assurance was a bit more prevalent. But whether we need to go to the extent where we have a matrix, you know, attached to each kind of paper, I think is a bit of a slippery slope, and we need to just be cautious how we do that. But I really wanted to say well done to the team for pulling this together.
Thank you, Brian. Now, Vary, is your hand's still up, Vary, thank you.
Yeah, these are just small points, I guess, Mark. What I realised was I probably need to get out more, because actually when I saw the document, I thought, this is lovely, well done, it's so exciting. But I do agree, frustratingly, between Nick and Steve. I'm not sure simplification is necessarily the word I would use in terms of the document itself, but actually, considering what it's attempting to do, I do recognise where you're coming from. I do think that there is a challenge as we go over time where we can have a look at how this gets used and how we interact with it as a service to see whether or not we can find a way to some extent to maybe simplify the document itself a little bit further. In terms of an engagement, I can see why it is of use. And I agree with Nick that when you actually go through it, it's a question of, well, what would come out of it? That's frustrating me a little bit, because actually, as I scrolled through page 30, I did think this isn't a nice, quick, simple guide in that sense, if that makes any sense. But I found the document itself very useful. Just a small point, actually, at the end of the principles, the page 15, the annual review and reporting, for me that just seemed a little bit floating, Mark, and it was just, I think there's a little bit about some of the order of some things from my side of things, and that it just kind of sits there, and I don't know if other people felt it just seems a bit random in that place. But I'm not disagreeing with Steve, but I'm pretty content that we progress with it as it is. It's a live document, and let's see if we can find a way to potentially streamline elements of it, maybe into the future, if that's helpful at all. But thank you for this. As I said, I need to get out more, Mark, but I like the layout of it very much.
Thank you very much, Mari. And again, I would echo what you said. When I read it, I enjoyed reading it as well, so maybe I need to get out a bit more as well.
Just if I can come in on this lull, I think it's been really interesting discussion and hearing the various points, and really interesting Steve's challenge, and certainly gives me food for thought about where we take this. As you know, as we've said here, it's an attempt to try and bring everything together in the first time and provide that both guide and place repository, as you've said. So it'll be interesting to see how we do this. And on the assurance piece, we will develop those assurance pieces with committees over the next period, and we'll see what that looks like. But in terms of the practicalities of changing our value added statements into assurance statements, but also, as Nick said right at the start, as committee chairs begin to feel more confident in the assurance that they're getting, they can use that language of assurance, and we can map that. But it's certainly been an interesting discussion, although not quite finished there. I fully understand, but thank you very much for the comments.
No, colleagues, apologies. We seem to be having ongoing IT glitches here. Thank you, Richard, for your input there. I was intending to go to Paul. Please, Paul, come in.
Initially, I thought this document was really good. And I like the fact that it pulled so much together in one place. I began to think about it, though, and I'm not unhappy with it, but I think as often it is almost too good. And it has become more than just a framework. It's become somewhere where we can put everything, and the danger is it's going to grow and grow. So I began to wonder, and Steve crystallized this for me, do we need to have all this in about principles? It's a little bit sort of saying, aren't we wonderful? We need to have the tables and the diagrams and the responsibilities, but do we need to have this statement of principles in here when we know we're done? It's about a quarter of the length of the document, and it's restating something that I don't disagree with any of it, but is it necessary is the question I'm asking. And I would be quite happy if we didn't have it for the first year, and if we found there was some debate about what the principles were, we put it in after the first year. But at the moment, we're just adding things in all the time. So that's just my view.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just reflecting on that. This, of course, is a document that has come from other documents. So there was the Code of Corporate Governance, which we had. We've added the issuance document. I think the phrase repository actually rather sums up what we've now got rather than framework. I guess the issue of what we do about that's a different one. So I'm going to bring in Malcolm, then Brian, and then let's see if we can tie our positions up. Malcolm.
Right, thank you. Yes, I do like the document. I absolutely accept Steve's challenge. I think that's right, but I still think at this stage we didn't have anything before, and I think this has been a really useful piece of work. Just one thought, I also particularly like the lines of defence. I thought that was a really nice way of putting it, the different levels of checks and audit controls or whatever. I wasn't so sure about the committee assurance statements, and it ties in with that in a sense, because the lines of defence are saying we've got these internal controls, there's ways of managing, looking at that, there's external audit. When it comes to something like the committee assurance statements, I would just welcome a comment on how that would fit in with this concept of multiple levels of control, which I think are really important, because I find it quite difficult to see how we would have the multiple levels of control around that. And just one very specific question, at the top of the committee assurance statements, we're saying we will develop statements of assurance. Can I just, I know there's been some discussion about that before. Have we agreed to do that, or are we being asked to do that as part of this?
I suppose your latter question, Malcolm, we're asking the board, we're proposing through the framework we do it, so we're asking the board to approve the framework, and if we approve the framework, we will take that piece of work forward with you. And I think your question about the relationship between assurance and the levels of control within the organisation, I think that's exactly what we need to tease out with the committees. So that you are giving the committees are giving assurance to the board that those controls within their part of the organisation are working in an appropriate fashion to give the committee the assurance that you seek. Now, we need to discuss that with you. That's a point that we need to tease out, because clearly what we don't want to do is to get down into the detail every single meeting of a committee on various aspects of how we're running the business, but we need that level of assurance for the committee and for the board. So we'll tease these questions out with you, Malcolm.
Yeah,
I don't have an answer.
Just
I certainly have views, and I think as we have those discussions with committees, all our views are on the table.
Would you see the committee assurance statement taking into account all the levels, the 4 lines of defence, if you like? Would it be saying we are assured because we see these different levels here, or would it be saying we are assured because of the work we're doing as a committee, if you know what I mean? I think that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll pick that up as part of the discussion, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Brian, last word, and then I'm going to make a recommendation.
Thanks, Kirsty, for the opportunity to come back in. I mean, I actually like the principles in this document, because it's a very clear statement of what, from a governance perspective, we consider to be important, and it illustrates how we're going to do that. I think there has to be a recognition that there is a wider audience for documents like this. There is a level of expectation that documents like this will say these types of things, and I think that the way that the document pulls together the high level principles and explains what they mean to us and how we're going to do it, I think if I were a broader kind of stakeholder, I would find that helpful. But as a board member, I'm very content with this document. If it's not, you know, ticking a box in terms of being a framework document, I'm less concerned about that. I think that the substance of it is spot on for me.
Thank you. So diversity of thought is one of the strengths of this board. It also, of course, is one of the challenges, because actually we've got some directly contradictory as well as enhancing and expansive views being expressed. I'm going to suggest that we do things pragmatically and that we approve this, and that we then take time to review it over time, but particularly in the autumn. I think there's a lot to think about, and I'm going to ask that we minute it back carefully so that it's there for Richard, Mark and others to consider, but that we need to move on from trying to fix this now and use it as a basis moving forward. So if we're content at that, I'm going to ask that we move into that we approve it now and that we move into the annual operating plan. Mark, please.
Thank you, Kirsty. By way of introduction to the plan, it's probably worth, again, just for the record, giving a bit of context to the annual operating plan itself. Within the governance and accountability framework for the service, it specifies that we should have an annual plan linked to the delivery of the strategic plan, and that's what the EOP ultimately is. It's not the totality of how we deliver the strategic plan, but it's the key actions as an SLT we recommend to the board for that. The more business as usual aspects of delivery against the strategic plan, they're captured through the performance management framework, and they're reported through the KPIs to the committee and to the board through the risk and performance report. So the AOP sits within the ambit of the strategic plan, but it's not the only way in which we chart progress against delivery of it. The actions in the in the annual operating plan, again, worth reminding ourselves, they're built up over a 3-year period. So when we produce a strategic plan for the 3-year period, we look across that as an SLT with the SMB in the organisation as well, of what will be the programme of work for the 3 years to deliver the strategic plan itself. The plan that you have before us is the last clearly in the cycle dealing with the current strategic plan, and it will take us through to October of this year, when hopefully a new strategic plan will be in place for the organisation itself. So what we've got today are actions that will see us through to that period of time, effectively close off most of our major work round about the current strategic plan. We've also this time taken on board a message from the board to the service about simplification again, and making sure that we pare back the annual operating plan to give ourselves a degree of flexibility to deal with any unforeseen circumstances. And clearly, last couple of years with COVID, we've had major issues across the organisation. We've had to flex the EOP accordingly. So again, this last 6 months for this current one, we've given ourselves a little flexibility because there's still a great deal of flux in our environment, not simply the overhangs from COVID, but budget situations and so forth. So that's where we are on it. What we propose is that over the course of the summer, we'll begin to give thought to the 22-25 strategic plan as well. We'll be looking at the programme of work that will support that. And again, we'll engage with the board members through discussions as we build that up over the course of the summer towards then the autumn, the publication of the new strategic plan, and then the annual operating plan thereafter. So this plan takes us up to that point. In October, when we put the new strategic plan before Parliament, we will then bring back a new annual operating plan, if that makes sense, that then is aligned to the new strategic plan. And again, we will have that 3-year programme of work in mind for the delivery of the new strategic plan. We'll then accommodate, or so we'll incorporate actions, any outstanding actions from this AOP into that EOP for you as well. Sorry for all the acronyms here as well. Clearly, as part of the process over the summer, we'll also be looking at the performance management framework itself. So again, that reporting against the strategic plan is looked at, and where we will then report through KPIs and other evidence to committees will be looked at in conjunction with the board itself. The current plan that we're putting forward for approval today is going to SLT. We think these are the appropriate actions to see ourselves through to October. And again, when the new strategic plan is in place, we'll bring this back for further consideration and reflect the detail of the new strategic plan itself. So with that, Kirsty, I'm going to clearly open up to board members for any questions, any comments, any challenge on the content of the EOP itself.
Thanks, Mark. Fiona?
Thank Thanks. Fiona Thorber, board member. My question is, so I get everything you've just said about the EOP and aligning it to the strategic plan, etc., and that's all really good. My question is, again, about how we join everything up with the changes. So I guess I've always had in my head that eventually the annual operating plan will be the plan that has everything in it, all the major projects, etc., so that we can understand dependencies. And and you mentioned further work on forward planning, because clearly, unless you see the totality of our activity, then capacity and etc., etc. So, what's my question? Is that still the intent, that we will have one plan that? Yeah, okay, you're nodding.
So what we do at the moment, Fiona, is the actions that sit within the AOP, as I say, we plan that for the 3-year cycle. That includes the interdependencies across the organisation to deliver on those actions, and they are then discussed in detail at SMB. And before we put anything into the AOP, we're given that level of assurance that, you know, if I require support from ICT on an action that sits with me, that's agreed, that's in the work plan for ICT and so forth. We did not in the past extend that into the change element. You're absolutely right. So we have committed to a piece of work. It's already kicked off. Richard and Andy Main are looking at that so that we bring the change elements together into the EOP in a much more clear fashion. So that total commitment, if you like, is more fully recognised going forward. The scrutiny of the change elements will still sit with the change committee, but we will have through the EOP that wider overview for the board so that you can see the totality of what we're doing, rather than just taking it in different slices through the various plans that we report to you. So that's certainly the direction of travel that we're on, yes. And again, we'll discuss that in detail with the board over the course of the summer months.
Lovely, thank you. And again, apologies if you see me looking slightly distracted. We're resolving ICT aspects here. Thanks for that. Lesley.
Thanks, Kirsty. And thanks for that introduction, Mark. And I understand absolutely why we've got a kind of bridging operating plan just now. I think the plan that you've given us is clear and succinct, and God, that's brilliant. It's always really good. My ask is that in autumn of this year, we as a board get to chew the cud on what we want in an annual operating plan. My view of an annual operating plan's content should be, here's what we're doing, business as usual, here's what we aim to achieve in business as usual, here's what we're changing, and here's how we think that will improve business as usual, because that's what change must be about, and here are the risks. At the moment, what this plan is providing is a list of the projects that are not the biggest projects. And whilst useful, it doesn't give me as a board member what I think should be in an annual operating plan. My views are not particularly important, but the board's views are, and I just wonder whether we could get a chance to discuss in good time the content of the annual operating plan for 23-24. Thank you.
Again, Lesley, I'll just say that the intention across the summer months is to have exactly that conversation. So, I say Richard and Andy are looking at the moment at the change elements. So when we bring that to you, we can have that wider discussion about the purposes of an EOP. What do we think is appropriate to be included within it and not? And again, that links back to also those discussions about assurance that we had in the previous agenda item, that we know that there are other systems across, or other approaches across the organisation delivering on behalf of the service, and the assurance that we're building up around about that also has to be taken into consideration. So absolutely agree with you. Let's have that discussion across the summer months, so that when we get to the autumn for the next annual operating plan linked to the new strategic plan, that we're all on the same page about the purposes and the content of what should and should not be in the AOP. And I'm sure we'll all have different views on that, but we'll get to a consensus on what the content should be. So happy to have that conversation in detail.
Okay, thank you.
Lovely, thanks. And we can make sure we've got a couple of bites of the cherry at that. So a scaffolding of what we think needs. We were on the annual operating plan. I have we got any other additional issues or concerns before we sign off and approve this, on the understanding that this is something we're going to be working with over the summer? Okay, lovely, thank you. We've got a minute of the various suggestions and actions, so that allows us to now move into the annual internal audit plan. So, Brian?
Oh, right, sorry, Kirsty. Yes, yeah, the last meeting of the audit committee considered the plan. It's obviously for you to come to a view whether you feel that the plan covers the right things. The audit committee certainly did, and what I would want to highlight is not just the content of the plan, but the process that was undertaken to develop the plan, because that really was very thorough, and involved the auditors having fairly detailed conversations with the executive team to make sure that their thoughts were consistent with those of the executive team. So what you have before you is slightly differently, it's a 2-year plan. That doesn't mean that it's absolutely cast in stone. It can be flexed if necessary, but it's helpful, I think, also to see the 2 years set side by side. And it's also helpful to be able to look back at the previous years to see what's been undertaken as well. So it feels certainly to the audit committee that it covers the right things, and the base and on that basis the committee recommends approval by the board today.
Any comments or questions before we approve? Stuart, please come in.
Thanks, Kirsty. Thanks, Brian. I'm more than comfortable with what you're suggesting. I just had one question though. Were there any particular issues that or concerns that drove the selection of any of the reviews?
No, I think it's a good question, Stuart. There were no issues highlighted in the discussions that suggested this was such a particularly high risk that we needed to do something about it. It was more that if we have to prioritise where we focus the audit attention, these are probably the areas that will add most value. And I think it's maybe helpful to state that, you know, there was quite a lot of discussion with the auditors about adding value as opposed to simply undertaking a piece of work that provided assurance of compliance. So there was that mix in the discussion that, you know, so that influenced the actual topics, and it will also influence how the auditors eventually go about doing the work that they're doing. Yes, they will do the compliance, but they will also be looking for every opportunity to feed back to the organisation that they might be able to do things differently or better.
Content on that basis to approve? Lovely, thank you very much. That takes us to the digital strategy, and we have Sandra with us again to support us, hopefully, in approving this report.
Yep, if you don't mind, Chair, I will just kick off. In terms of the digital strategy, the strategy has been produced and presented to board previously. It follows on from the original 14 to 17 and the 18 to 21 strategies, which, as we are all aware, were largely around the merging focus of the organisations at that particular time and also creating single systems, etc. This new strategy builds on that. It's been built through engagement across the service, including surveys, interviews, working groups and all the rest of it. It has previously been socialised at SLT and the board, and feedback taken on board in that regard. The omission of the EIA, the impact assessment, equality impact assessment, has now been rectified and is included. So if Sandra's there and wants to cover any more detail, I'm not sure whether Sandra's on or not.
Yeah, oh, lovely, thank you,
Yeah.
Sandra.
Okay, Sandra, I'll just...
Additional Sandra, or content just for questions?
I'm content with questions. I think we have covered it, you know, last time round, so I'm quite happy to take any further questions. I suppose one point is that the equality impact assessment has not created any changes that were required to the document itself. So it's as is from the last time. So I'm happy to take any further questions.
Comments, questions, or are we happy to accept that we scrutinised at the last meeting and we just moved to approval? Looks like we're moving to approval. Thank you, Sandra, and Paul, for your assistance there. Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that takes us to standing order for regulation of contracts. And John, please.
Thank you, Chair. John Thompson, Acting Director of Finance and Procurement. This paper is seeking approval for the amendments to the standing orders for the regulation of contracts, which board members will know is a reserved matter. I know we've talked a lot about governance today, but this is another piece of governance which reflects how we set out our governance arrangements in relation to procurement activity, and it has to be in line with both legislation and Scottish Government guidance. At 3.4, I would highlight that all staff involved in the procurement activity are required to follow the standing orders, and the standing orders have therefore been updated to reflect the latest legislation and guidance, but also, quite importantly, to devolve the procurement to directorates and throughout the procurement team. The main reason behind that was a desire on my part to enable more on the procurement side and make sure that we can actually ensure that the procurement processes are both streamlined and are effective, and that requires some additional delegations. So I just wanted to highlight the key changes to the document. At 3.7, there is, following EU exit, we now follow the World Trade Organization financial thresholds. So those have been refreshed as at January 22, and therefore they're amended in the document, and you can see that at Appendix 1A. And as I said, the other aspects are more around the kind of internal perspectives to try and enable the procurement process. So at 3.8, I wanted to highlight the use of the Innovation Partnership Procedure. That's a procedure that we are quite keen to create a kind of pathfinder project around, primarily as it helps us in terms of delivering innovation. So we've captured and highlighted that as part of the process. At 3.9, the works contracts are now covered by Scottish Government guidance in terms of the construction manual, so that's highlighted. And then at 3.10, we've amended some of the processes. Sorry, I'm getting an echo. Are we okay? I'll crack on and then.
Yeah, okay. So I'm muted. Bear with us a moment. I am muted on my Jabber, but for some reason.
Okay. Will I press on?
Yeah, please press on.
Perfect, thank you. So in terms of the internal changes, the quick quote process, typically under the quick quote process, we require 4 quotes, and we've changed that to 3, just again to simplify and streamline the administration around that. We've also devolved the ability to award contracts to directors and heads of function up to £50,000. And we've devolved the ability to contracts to category leads and procurement specialists, as they have the professional training to actually undertake the procurement process. And we've also allowed the category leads to drive forward the kind of routes to market that are described as part of the commodity strategies. The other thing I would highlight at 418.2, just to respond back to Brian, that's where we see the development around the use of consultants, and you'll see reference there as to what happens up to 2000 and beyond. And basically, I'm asking for questions from the board and seek approval of the revised standing orders for regulation of contracts. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Any comments or questions on that revised document? Content, Brian? Yeah, Brian, I saw your hands go up physically first, Brian, and then I'm aware Lesley you want in. Brian?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to find my hand. John, could you just clarify in terms of those delegated limits, you know, the 50,000, the 500,000, the 4 million, etc. Have these actually changed? And I would be interested to understand, you know, at one level, I understand the desire to relax and to devolve and do all that. But there's always going to be a risk that doing that, you know, weakens the controls that are exercised. So I wonder if you'd just comment on whether these limits have actually changed from what they were previously, and whether from a control perspective you're confident that the new arrangements will be subject to appropriate controls.
Yes, thank you, Brian, for that question. So this is a change, so they haven't been adopted in the past. Primarily what has happened is both the Director of Financial and Contractual Services or the Head of Finance and Procurement were the only individuals who could, along with the Chief Officer, actually authorise contracts. And I think that there is a practical issue around that, where we actually want to make sure that we can devolve that with the two individuals who both have the appropriate capability and understanding, but also just enable the procurement process so that we don't become a bit of a blocker in actually progressing our day-to-day work. So that was part of the rationale behind it. I also think it's important to empower our individuals throughout the teams, in particular within the procurement function. They are well qualified. They have their own professional standards to meet, and therefore I think it's appropriate that we devolve some of that authority to them. So that's the desire behind it. In terms of risk, this is all part of our audit trail and our processes around that. So there is sufficient segregation of duties between individuals. We make sure that if there's any conflicts of interest, those are captured as well. So I'm looking at it from the point of view of both enablement, but also still having the relevant level of control, Brian. So hopefully that helps you.
If I may just come back, Kirsty, is that okay? I just want to make sure that I understand one thing correctly, John. In terms of those procurement specialists making these decisions, it actually feels quite unusual if they are making the decision on the award of contract as opposed to the service lead. You know, the procurement is a support function rather than a decision making. So maybe you could kind of clarify that. The other point I wanted just to make, particularly on the contracts up to 4 million, you know, which is a substantial amount of money. How does that delegated authority sit and reconcile to, you know, the business case process and the checks and balances that are in that process? So, you know, I think the thing that's particularly at the front of my mind in thinking about this is round about CCF, you know, and the decisions of that. But there will be other kind of major projects, because it seems that we're looking at this almost in kind of isolation. But there is a significant kind of preamble in terms of process and checks and balance for an awarded contract up to £4 million. Surely, you know, it needs to be budgeted for to begin with, but it needs to be presumably set in the context. And it would be helpful, I think, to understand that context in the document.
Yeah. If I could come back on that, Chair, if that's okay. So Brian, I understand your point. I guess what the standing orders is covering is the procurement authority, and recognising therefore that there is other authorities that are required across the organisation, be that financial authority, be that actually in terms of being a budget holder, and also going through that budgeting process to establish if this is something that we want to do in line with our strategic plan. So there is sufficient in there in my mind that we need to make sure we've got a business case. We need to make sure that we're pushing forward with a particular proposal, and that's got the wider stakeholder involvement and also authorisation where appropriate from the board. What we are then talking about is, having agreed some of those things, how are we going to take that forward and procure those goods and services? And that's where the procurement authority comes in. And then getting back to your point around why the procurement specialists are working with the directorates themselves, and we do that through the user intelligence group, and we come to conclusions around what the requirement is and what we're trying to achieve in terms of the overall service provision. The point around the procurement specialist signing off the actual contract award is more to make sure that we have done everything that we know that we need to in terms of the legislation to be both transparent and fair, and one that we can then say, well, look, if we were challenged with this, do we have sufficient evidence to make sure that we have conducted the process appropriately? And I think it is right that those procurement specialists who have that knowledge and understanding do actually sign off on the actual contracts to say, yes, this has happened. So that's the kind of purpose behind it, Brian.
Yeah, I think, sorry, and I don't want to extend this, but they are not the budget holders, so they are not signing off the expenditure. They're confirming that from a procurement expertise point of view, they are content. So it's maybe just perhaps in the language, kind of, John, but on the broader point about, yes, this is just about procurement authorization. I think it really does need to be linked back to that broader kind of governance control environment. Because we do need to, if we have too many of these in isolation reference points, it's hard to actually see the bigger picture. And we had that same sort of conversation when we talked about delegated limits earlier. So it's perhaps just making that cross-reference back in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I think there's value in that cross-reference. I think that the point here is that we will also have to take on board guidance from Scottish Government, and there's also changes to thresholds, etc. So that's why we try and keep the document separate but linked to the overall scheme of delegation. But I take your point, Brian, the point around the budget authority. The budget authority is the first part of this. We don't actually procure something if we don't have that budget authority in the first place. So the first question is, do you have the budget for this? And if so, the budget holder is saying, yes, I'm content, we want to progress it. So hopefully that gives you some comfort, Brian.
Content on that basis to approve? Lovely, thank you. That takes us to reports for information only. We have two, SFRS Safety and Assurance Strategy and UK Fire Standards Update. On the first one, we do have John Dickey with us in case there are any questions or comments that we need to address on that paper, or if John has anything he feels he needs to add to it.
Thanks, Chair. John Dickey, Director of Training, Safety and Assurance. Board colleagues, this is in front of you for noting, as the Chair has said, and for information. It's been through the full governance process and was approved via scrutiny at the People Committee last month. So I've got Julie on. I've got Julie here as well if there's any other technical questions that I can't answer. Thank you. That's it, Chair.
Nick, please come in.
Chair, thank you. John, very simple, very quick question. Why a 5-year strategy instead of, say, a 4-year strategy? Simply, that question came to me when I read the content of year 4 and year 5, which I appreciate is 4 or 5 years away, but it seems to be just a bit thin on the ground. And I thought to myself, oh, that it seems to me on reading what's written there, that could be a 4-year strategy. That was it.
Nick, no real reason other than we chose a 5-year strategy, the 5-year strategy for the training strategy. So both of them are aligned correctly. The idea behind this was, as I finish, it leaves the successor to come in with 2 strategies that they can work off of moving forward and then change as is required. So we thought a 5-year strategy would be would give it a degree of flexibility, but no real science to it, Nick. So I can't give you a fuller answer other than that.
It was a curiosity question. Thank you very much, John. That's alignment is as good an answer as any other. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we will note that UK fire standards update. Again, we've got Ross with us if there were any questions or comments. Board colleagues, I see that Lesley has put her hand up. Nick, is your hand up on that as well? No, Lesley, please come in.
Thanks very much. It's just interesting to see these, and I had a look at the standards themselves. They're very, very high level, but just good to see. I was just wondering, Ross, how are we picking up any actions that arise from these standards? And I just wondered whether it might be of interest, and Nick may have a view in this, and it's his call as chair of the Service Delivery Committee. I wonder whether there might be a bit of interest from the Service Delivery Committee in actually just having a wee further look at how we perform against these standards. It's just of interest comparing what we do to others. Thank you.
Thanks, Lesley. And Ross will come in and also orient you a little to this document too.
Thanks, Lesley. So in terms of your first question, which was in relation to any action plans, of the standards that we've undertaken a self-assessment of thus far, there's not been any significant gaps that's made that appropriate. However, I would add the caveat that that's very much been a self-assessment by us as opposed to any external parties. And part of the reason for bringing this to the board was, first of all, to update the board on the fact that the standards in place. They've got a much stronger footing in England, but we have undertaken self-assessments against them. Robert Scott, who was in the meeting earlier but has had to leave for another commitment, he's met with the Fire Standards Board as well, and clearly it's a matter for him if he wants to use them as a benchmark for any of his future work. And in terms of any further scrutiny, I resisted the temptation to provide the board with the full self-assessments we've undertaken, because I know that you get a lot of paperwork in front of you anyway. But if the board feel that the committee wants to take a more detailed look in terms of our self-assessments of any of them thus far or any future ones, we're more than happy to take those to the relevant committees, Lesley. Thanks.
Nick, shall I bring you in for comment on that?
Thank you, Chair. That's very kind of you. Ross and I had a brief conversation just yesterday, I think, about this, and we'll discuss it offline and see whether or not that is something that we can bring into the SDC. Chair, can you hear me?
I'm afraid we've got ongoing sound difficulties here. Can you? Yeah, Ross is going to take a lead from his computer.
And Ross, are you're happy with that, just for the continuity of the meeting? Yeah.
Apologies, Nick, we didn't have sound in the room there. Could you repeat what you said?
Oh, very briefly, I said that you and I had a brief conversation yesterday by message, and we touched on that very point that Lesley brought up. Let's have a conversation offline, Ross, and see what would be appropriate or not to bring to the SDC, and to see whether or not there's any overview the SDC could provide that would then provide some assurance to the board.
Yeah, more than happy with that from my perspective. Thanks.
Okay, so no. Can you hear me now? Lovely. Okay, apologies. Thank you for that. We will note those reports and have follow-up at the Service Delivery Committee. That takes us on to risk themes, and I'm not aware of identifying any further risks or any change in the level of risk, so I think we can acknowledge that and move on. The forward plan, there's nothing to add in addition to the paper that we've been supplied with. So if we are content on that basis, that takes us to the end of the public meeting, with the next meeting being on the 30th of June, which we are hopeful will be an in-person meeting. We are at 12:15. Obviously, we need to get enough time for a lunch break. I'm going to suggest that, given we're only 15 minutes over our schedule, we come back at 12:45. That allows half an hour for everybody to get fed and watered, because we have quite a long afternoon. So I will see you again, probably from another room at 12:45. Thank you very much, colleagues. See you again soon.